It is the source and summit of the entire Christian life. In Catholic churches across the world, the faithful process forward to receive what they believe is the most intimate gift imaginable: the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Jesus Christ in the Holy Eucharist. It is a moment of profound communion, a foretaste of heaven itself. But this sublime act comes with a stark and sobering warning delivered by the Apostle Paul himself in sacred scripture, a warning against receiving the Lord in an unworthy manner. What does it mean to be unworthy? What sins are so grave that they sever our communion with God and make receiving the Eucharist not a source of grace, but an act of sacrilege? The Church, in her wisdom as a loving mother, provides a clear and urgent answer.
Chapter 1. The foundational distinction: mortal versus venial sin. Before we can explore any list of specific sins, we must first understand the most fundamental distinction in Catholic moral teaching: the difference between mortal sin and venial sin. This is not an arbitrary classification. It is a crucial diagnosis of the health of our souls. Venial sin is a sin that wounds our relationship with God. It is a disobedience to God's law in a less serious matter, or in a grave matter, but without full knowledge or complete consent. Venial sins weaken charity, show a disordered affection for created goods, and hinder the soul's progress in the life of virtue. Using the analogy of physical health, a venial sin is like a sickness. It makes you weak, it harms your well-being, but it does not kill you. These sins, while they should be repented of, do not sever our relationship with God and do not, by themselves, prevent us from receiving Holy Communion. As the Eucharist itself can forgive venial sins, mortal sin, however, is something entirely different. A mortal sin is a spiritual catastrophe. It is a grave violation of God's law that destroys the life of grace in the soul. It is a conscious and free choice to turn away from God and to prefer an inferior good to Him. For a sin to be mortal, 3 conditions must be met simultaneously. As the Catechism of the Catholic Church in paragraph 1857 makes clear, first, it must involve grave matter. The act itself must be seriously and intrinsically evil. The 10 Commandments are the primary guide for what constitutes grave matter. Second, it must be committed with full knowledge. The person must know and understand that the act they are committing is gravely sinful. Third, it must be committed with deliberate consent. The person must freely and intentionally choose to commit the act. If all 3 of these conditions are met, the sin is mortal. Using our health analogy, a mortal sin is not a sickness. It is a fatal wound. It severs our friendship with God and cuts us off from the life of grace. To be in a state of mortal sin is to be spiritually dead. It is for this reason that the Church teaches, with the force of 2,000 years of tradition, that anyone conscious of having committed a mortal sin must not receive Holy Communion without first having received absolution in the sacrament of confession. To do so, as St. Paul warns, is to eat and drink judgment upon oneself. Chapter 2. The framework of grave matter, the 10 Commandments. So what constitutes grave matter? The Church does not provide an exhaustive legalistic list of every possible mortal sin. Instead, she gives us a divine framework, the 10 Commandments. The commandments are not arbitrary rules. They are the blueprint for love. The first 3 commandments teach us how to love God, and the last 7 teach us how to love our neighbor. A grave violation of any of these commandments constitutes a serious failure in the love we owe to God and neighbor. Over the next 2 parts, we will explore 12 categories of grave sin, using this divine framework as our guide. Sins directly against faith. The first commandment is, I am the Lord your God. You shall have no other gods before me. Our faith is the foundation of our entire relationship with God. Therefore, sins that directly and willfully attack this foundation are gravely sinful. This category includes apostasy, which is the total repudiation of the Christian faith. It includes heresy, which is the obstinate post-baptismal denial of some truth which must be believed with divine and Catholic faith. And it includes schism, which is the refusal of submission to the Roman pontiff or of communion with the members of the Church subject to him. To consciously and freely reject the very faith that God has revealed is a mortal sin. Sins against hope. The first commandment also calls us to a radical trust or hope in God's mercy and providence. This virtue can be mortally wounded by two opposing sins, despair and presumption. Despair is the sin of ceasing to hope for personal salvation from God, for help in attaining it, or for the forgiveness of sins. It is the belief that one's own sinfulness is greater than God's infinite mercy, a tragic and grave insult to the power of the cross. Its opposite is presumption. This sin takes two forms, either presuming upon one's own capacities, hoping to be able to save oneself without help from on high, or presuming upon God's almighty power or his mercy, hoping to obtain his forgiveness without conversion and glory without merit. Both sins are a rejection of God as he truly is. Sins against charity, love. Love of God is the greatest commandment. Therefore, sins that directly attack this love are of the gravest matter. This can include indifference to God's love or ingratitude for it. It can manifest as spiritual sloth, known as acedia, which is a sadness or boredom with spiritual things that leads one to reject the joy that comes from God. At its most extreme, this can become a conscious hatred of God, which is born of pride and curses God for forbidding sins and inflicting punishments. To willfully hate the source of all goodness and love is a definitive act of spiritual rebellion, blasphemy and sacrilege. The second commandment instructs us not to take the Lord's name in vain. The gravest violations of this command are blasphemy and sacrilege. Blasphemy consists in uttering against God, inwardly or outwardly, words of hatred, reproach, or defiance. It is also blasphemous to speak ill of God, to abuse his name or to misuse it. To intentionally use the name of God, Jesus Christ, the Virgin Mary, or the saints in a hateful and contemptuous way is a grave sin. Sacrilege consists in profaning or treating unworthily the sacraments and other liturgical actions, as well as persons, things, or places consecrated to God. The most serious form of sacrilege, as St. Paul warns, is the unworthy reception of the Eucharist, which is why this entire discussion is so critical. Deliberately missing Sunday Mass. The third commandment is, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. For Christians, this commandment is fulfilled by celebrating the Lord's Day Sunday, the day of the resurrection. The Church specifies that the faithful are obligated to participate in the Mass on all Sundays and other holy days of obligation. To deliberately and without a serious reason fail in this obligation is a grave sin. Why? Because the Mass is the highest form of worship we can offer to God. It is the representation of Christ's sacrifice on Calvary. To willfully skip Mass is to tell God that something else, sleep, sports, work, or leisure, is more important than giving him the worship he is due and receiving the supernatural grace he desires to give us in the Eucharist. Serious reasons that excuse this obligation include illness, the need to care for an infant or a sick person, or an inability to get to a Mass. Grave disobedience to parents or lawful authority. The fourth commandment, honor your father and your mother, is the foundation of social life. It commands us to honor and respect our parents, to whom we owe our life and who have handed on the faith to us. While simple childhood disobedience is not grave matter, serious offenses can be. This includes grave disrespect, nursing hatred for a parent, wishing them evil, or in a serious way refusing to care for them in their old age or times of need. This commandment also extends to our duties toward our homeland and those who govern us. While we are not obligated to obey unjust laws, grave and willful disobedience to just civil authority is also a violation of this commandment. These first 6 categories of grave sin all strike at the very heart of our covenant, relationship with God. They are sins against faith, hope, and love, sins against his holy name, and sins against the sacred obligations of worship and family. They sever the vertical connection between our souls and our Creator. But the moral law does not stop there. The commandments that follow demand that our love for God be made manifest in a radical love for our neighbor. The next set of sins we will explore are those that attack the dignity of the human person in the most profound ways possible. sins against life, against the sacred bond of marriage, and against the very fabric of justice that holds society together. Having explored the grave sins that directly rupture our relationship with God, we now turn to the second tablet of the Decalogue. The Lord's Prayer teaches us that our plea for divine mercy is intrinsically linked to our willingness to extend mercy to others. The following categories of mortal sin demonstrate this truth with sobering clarity. They are sins that attack the image of God in our neighbor, violating their fundamental dignity and rights. To commit these acts is to fail not only in our love for our neighbor, but to fail in our love for the God in whose image they are made. 7 sins against human life. The 5th commandment is unequivocal. You shall not kill. This is a prohibition against the direct and intentional taking of innocent human life. The Catechism affirms that all human life, from the moment of conception until natural death, is sacred and inviolable. Therefore, several actions constitute grave matter under this commandment. Willful murder is the most obvious. Another is direct abortion. The Church has taught from the 1st century that every procured abortion is a grave moral evil, as it is the killing of the most defenseless of all human beings. Likewise, euthanasia, the act of putting an end to the lives of handicapped, sick, or dying persons, is morally unacceptable. And finally, suicide. The willful taking of one's own life is a grave offense against the love of self, neighbor, and God, who is the sovereign master of life. While grave psychological disturbances can diminish responsibility for this act, it remains objectively a grave sin. To be in a state of grace requires a profound respect for the sanctity of every human life. Sins of lust and impurity. The 6th commandment, you shall not commit adultery, and the 9th commandment, you shall not covet your neighbor's wife, call us to the virtue of chastity. Chastity is the successful integration of our sexuality within our person, placing it at the service of love. Mortal sins in this category are grave violations against this virtue. Adultery, which is marital infidelity, is a profound injustice that violates the covenant of marriage. Fornication, which is sexual intercourse between an unmarried man and an unmarried woman, is gravely contrary to the dignity of persons and of human sexuality, which is naturally ordered to the good of spouses and the generation of children. The viewing of pornography is a grave offense, as it perverts the conjugal act and immerses all who are involved in the illusion of a fantasy world. Masturbation is an intrinsically and gravely disordered action, as it seeks sexual pleasure outside of the procreative and unitive purposes of the marital act. Finally, homosexual acts are described by the Catechism as acts of grave depravity, as they are contrary to the natural law and close the sexual act to the gift of life. Sins of stealing and greed. The 7th commandment, you shall not steal, and the 10th commandment, you shall not covet your neighbor's goods, are the foundation of social justice. They forbid the unjust taking or keeping of the goods of one's neighbor. Theft is the most obvious example. Taking something that does not belong to you, if the value is significant, is a mortal sin that requires not only confession, but also restitution, the returning of the stolen goods. This category also includes business practices like defrauding a worker of their just wage, which the Bible calls a sin that cries out to heaven. It includes tax evasion, when done on a grave scale, and any form of business fraud or willful damage to private or public property. At its root, these sins are a violation of the universal destination of goods and the right to private property, and they are born from the vices of greed and envy. Sins of lying and deception. The 8th commandment, you shall not bear false witness against your neighbor, calls us to live in the truth. Jesus himself is the truth, and his disciples are called to be witnesses to it. Grave sins against this commandment are those that do grave damage to the reputation of another. The most serious is perjury, which is making a promise under oath with no intention of keeping it, or lying under oath in a court of law. Another grave sin is calumny or slander, which is telling lies about another person in order to harm their reputation. Similarly, the sin of detraction is gravely sinful. This is the act of revealing another person's real hidden faults to someone who did not know them, without a valid reason. To destroy a person's good name is a form of spiritual murder, and it is a mortal sin that requires not only confession, but a sincere effort to repair the damage done. Sins of anger and vengeance. While the fifth commandment directly forbids killing, Jesus, in the Sermon on the Mount, radicalizes this command, showing that it begins in the heart. He warns that anyone who is gravely angry with his brother is liable to judgment. While fleeting moments of anger are a normal human passion, to willfully and deliberately nurse a deep-seated hatred for another person, wishing them grave harm, is a mortal sin. It is a direct and conscious violation of the new commandment that Christ gave us, to love one another as He has loved us. This also includes the grave sin of refusing to forgive someone who has wronged you, and instead choosing to harbor a desire for vengeance. To desire evil for another person is to align one's own will with the will of the devil, who is a murderer from the beginning. Willful and serious negligence of duty. This final category is a broad one, but it is of critical importance. Mortal sin is not only committed by doing evil, it can also be committed by failing to do good. Each of us in our state in life has serious duties and responsibilities. A parent has a grave duty to care for and spiritually form their children. A spouse has a grave duty to be faithful and to love their partner. A doctor, a police officer, a public official all have grave duties related to their profession. To willfully and seriously neglect these duties in a way that could cause grave harm to others is a mortal sin of omission. It is the sin of the priest and the Levite in the parable of the Good Samaritan, who saw the wounded man and chose to pass by on the other side. It is a failure in the fundamental Christian duty of charity. Final conclusion. We began with the beautiful image of the Holy Eucharist and the stark warning from St. Paul about receiving it unworthily. Our journey through these 12 categories of grave sin is not meant to inspire fear or scrupulosity, but to foster a profound sense of reverence and a clear understanding of the spiritual reality of our choices. The distinction between mortal and venial sin is a gift from the Church, a diagnostic tool to help us understand the state of our souls. The requirement to confess all mortal sins before receiving communion is not an arbitrary rule, but a loving invitation. It is an invitation to be healed, to have the spiritual death of mortal sin washed away by the blood of Christ in the sacrament of confession, so that we may approach His altar not with a guilty conscience, but with a pure heart, ready to receive the very life of God into our souls. To prepare for communion is one of the most profound acts of love we can engage in, for it is to prepare our hearts to become a worthy throne for the King of Kings.